Now, I'm also going to get really, really spicy right now. So if this is it, if this is the moment I get cancelled, then it's been a good run. It's been a good 11 videos. Betty Mcknit is not your mum. She doesn't owe you anything. And I think that ageism and misogyny are playing a big role here. Hi, my name's Sophie, aka Cinema Knit, and this is my YouTube channel where I talk about all things knitting and crochet. And today we are going to be getting into something spicy that I feel compelled to talk about, and I might regret this. But we are going to be talking about the 6-Day Star Blanket by Betty Mcknit and the recent controversy and drama surrounding it. And specifically, I would like to talk about a few things, including accessibility in the knitting and crochet community, and what we mean by that and what we can do to improve it, how we treat designers and designs, how we value our craft and the people who have been keeping it alive, and the ways in which slow crafting, like knitting and crochet, interacts with things like hyperconsumption, overconsumption, immediate gratification. So, strap in if that sounds like your sort of thing. I often make podcast videos and I also make project vlogs. I'm making 2 videos a week through December as a kind of nod towards Vlogmas. So please do like and subscribe if this is your sort of thing. And let's get into it. So first of all, let's get into who these 2 people are. So Betty Mcknit is a crochet designer, a teacher, and a community organizer. As far as I can tell, this is her full-time job. She is a full-time designer and teacher and runs a community and like support group and stuff like that. She is a very well-respected designer and has been around for, I think, 15 or 20 years. And 6 years ago, she launched a pattern called a 6-Day Star Blanket, which is an adult version of a kid's blanket that she had already had out for quite a long time. And it is a crochet star blanket. Now, Betty Mcknit, by her own admission, didn't invent the star blanket or the star pattern. Star patterns in crochet have been around for quite a while. I will put some examples on screen. You can see them in like doilies, in children's blankets, in all kinds of constellations. And they are made in various ways using combinations of stitches, for example, single crochets, half double crochets, double crochets, triple crochets. And a little bit like the granny square, there are many variations of the star shape in crochet, made with many different types of stitches. But what Betty Mcknit did invent was this particular pattern, using a combination of double crochet, single crochet, and granny clusters to create this kind of ripply star pattern. I'll be upfront, I haven't made the star blanket, but even though it's been out for 6 years, it has recently gone viral, and it has gone viral mostly on TikTok. As most of you probably know, crochet is having a massive renaissance, particularly amongst, I would say, younger millennials and Gen Z. And the star blanket has gone viral over the last few months, and more people are making it. The pattern is written in a style that I would say is quite old-fashioned. And that's not meant to be derogatory at all. But it's written in a pattern that you might be more familiar with from knit and crochet books or magazine patterns or blog patterns than, for example, a contemporary crochet pattern maybe written by a younger person or a newer person. I would say that I've noticed that the trend in patterns, particularly by younger and newer designers, is to use more descriptive language, to have a combination of like photographs and written instructions, and for those written instructions to be quite explicit and long-winded, but kind of very precise. And it's less likely that you're going to get a pattern that is mostly just made of abbreviations and row counts and stitch counts and things like that. So I would say the pattern is very much like a pattern that you would find in a knit and crochet magazine, and very much like another pattern that you would find on something like a crochet blog from more than 5 years ago. So it's available for free on her blog with adverts, and there are lots, and that will be important later. So there are lots of adverts, and it's quite an old-fashioned blog, but I mean, she's not the only person who makes her patterns free in that way. And it's also available as a video tutorial on her YouTube. And both of those obviously are free at point of use. The YouTube and the blog post are both free. And then there's also a paid written pattern, which is, I think, $5 or $6, where you can have a PDF of the pattern with none of the adverts. So those are the 3 ways in which the star blanket pattern is available. And the 6-day star blanket is designed to be made in 6 days. And there's a trend on YouTube where you unfurl like each day of the blanket as you've made it. It's gone viral, and I can see why. The idea of being able to make a project in 6 days is very appealing. The blanket is really pretty. It's very Instagrammable. It's very adaptable. You can use scrap yarn for it. You only really need to know a few stitches, and you're not doing anything that requires an enormous amount of knowledge about like garment construction or anything like that. You're working like flat but in the round, so you're not kind of constructing a 3-dimensional object. It's kind of to some extent 2-dimensional because it's just a flat blanket, but it's a really interesting final shape, so I can see why it's so popular, and it has particularly popped off with younger and newer crocheters and a lot of beginner crocheters. Because of its virality, it has recently faced some criticism. And this criticism all came to a head a couple of weeks ago when a crocheter called Naughty Brie Crochet made a TikTok video talking about how they found the pattern inaccessible to them. They were talking about how they had an intellectual disability, and following the written pattern on Betty Mcknit's blog was for a number of reasons not an ideal experience for them, and actually like an access issue. And they found that the pattern wasn't friendly towards those that might have intellectual disabilities. It was confusing to follow. It was very difficult to keep up with the stitch count. The amount of adverts on the blog were making the pattern to her like borderline unreadable, and they just found the pattern very difficult to follow. And people in response shared that they also found the pattern very inaccessible to them. And from there, Naughty Brie Crochet created a Google document where she basically rewrote Betty Mcknit's pattern and began to distribute it to those who wanted to follow the pattern but found it inaccessible. From there, Betty Mcknit privately reached out to Naughty Brie Crochet and asked them to stop distributing the document, which is understandable. It's their pattern. Obviously, it's available in 3 formats: a paid PDF, a free blog post, and a free YouTube tutorial. Now, the YouTube tutorial and the blog post are free at point of use. They're free at point of access to us. But the way that Betty Mcknit, whose full-time job this is able to get paid from those is through ad revenue. So obviously, us spending time on the pattern page on the website, every time we scroll an advert, that's ad revenue being paid to Betty Mcknit through the blog. And through YouTube, as most of us know, once you have a certain amount of subscribers, you are paid AdSense money. So understandably, having a kind of bootlegged version of her pattern in circulation and drawing traffic away from her website and away from her YouTube, and having her name attached to a pattern that she didn't actually write, that she has no control over, like that's not ideal really as a pattern designer. It's actually probably quite hurtful emotionally and financially. So understandably, she asked Naughty Brie Crochet to take it down. And this exchange was private. Nobody shared screenshots, so we don't actually know what was said. But Naughty Brie Crochet agrees to take the Google Doc down, but then decides to put it up as a Canva post and is suggesting that people might want to screenshot it before that also gets taken down. And also at this point starts making videos, which have now all been taken down. So unfortunately, we don't have copies of them, saying that Betty Mcknit had been quite short with them, that they hadn't been spoken to that way before, that they kind of implying that they had kind of a bad attitude about it, and that also that Naughty Brie Crochet was saying that they had approached Betty Mcknit in advance to ask them to make it more accessible to those with intellectual disabilities. And Betty Mcknit apparently said, no, I'm not going to rewrite it. I probably won't rewrite it. And this is all just reported. None of this has been confirmed. So at this point, Naughty Brie Crochet makes another video saying that she's had to take down the Google document because Betty Mcknit implied that she might take legal action, which honestly it would be within her rights to do, but also that she's decided to make it a Canva post instead. And then also just saying that they had never been spoken to like that before. The Betty Mcknit had been very kind of short and terse and potentially rude, which again, I would argue is kind of within her rights. Like, I'd be pissed off too. I would be pissed off if somebody stole my work and was distributing it for free. And I think it can also be very difficult to be accused of ableism for a pattern that is written in honestly a pretty standard way. And I want to talk about ableism and accessibility in the community in a minute, because it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. But then it kind of snowballed and people started making videos critiquing Betty Mcknit's patterns, critiquing her as a person, suggesting that she is greedy. The phrase greedy old bat was used at one point, suggesting that taking this resource away from those with intellectual disabilities was harming the disabled community and working against them, and was kind of a sign of like ableism and bigotry. And also defending Knotty Brie Crochet, who at no point had tried to make any money off this. And also, there was a wider question about whether or not it was technically illegal, because it's very difficult in some ways to copyright patterns in the same way that it's very difficult to copyright food recipes. And with something like knitting and crochet, where we're working with a craft that has been around for hundreds of years and has been passed down orally and been taught through generations and in community, a lot of the knowledge that we have is not written down, and a lot of it is not copyrighted or attributed to one particular person. Like, there is no one person who's responsible for inventing the half double crochet. So there were lots of questions about whether or not this is technically illegal, and lots of discourse about whether or not the Betty Mcknit has any right to be proprietary over the 6-day star blanket, considering it's not the only star blanket out there. You can find other types of star blanket tutorials and patterns, like paid and free, out there. But that sort of begs the question, if it's not a particularly original design and it's not a particularly good design, which are some of the arguments going around, it kind of begs the question, well, why do you all want to make it then? And that's another topic that I want to cover, is like virality and overconsumption and a desire for like instant gratification that unfortunately things like TikTok really feed. And I am certainly not above it. So that's something else I want to talk about. So that was a lot of the criticism being leveled at Betty Mcknit, and it kind of became a game of telephone, where a lot of videos were being made and there was a lot of hearsay, and people were reporting things as though they were fact. For example, that Betty Mcknit had threatened to sue Knotty Brie Crochet and take legal action. Betty Mcknit had been rude and mean to people who had expressed confusion over the pattern and hadn't been helpful to them. That Betty Mcknit was actively harming the disabled community and taking resources away from them, that the disabled community were being excluded from the crochet world, from crafting, from having a hobby because of Betty Mcknit. And it's been pretty awful. And I will say that Knotty Brie Crochet has also faced a lot of backlash from it, to the point where I think they have now shut down their TikTok. And it kind of snowballed. And Knotty Brie Crochet's initial intention was just to make the pattern accessible to people who really wanted to make the 6-day star blanket, but couldn't follow, for whatever reason, Betty Mcknit's written pattern or the video tutorial. They had this kind of like intention of just it being a community resource, and it turned into something that was kind of snowballed into something that was much more, that has really done a lot of damage, I think, to both of them. So I want to cover two things. I think I first want to talk about accessibility and what we mean by that, how it could be improved, and what the limitations of accessibility are. And then I want to talk about patterns going viral and why it's not always a good thing, and the connection between a certain pattern becoming very popular and a wider trend of overconsumption or hyperconsumption, and our need for instant gratification and confusing things we want with things that we need. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what it's reasonable to expect from any given pattern designer and what we can do to be more inclusive. So here we go. So we're going to have a look at Betty Mcknit's pattern. It's on a blog that does have adverts. And I will say that she begins by saying, this is an easy pattern, but not a beginner pattern. You will need to know how to chain, single crochet and double crochet. The pattern doesn't teach these skills, but there are plenty of resources online and elsewhere to learn from. And then there's a very extensive kind of intro telling you just like what the abbreviations are, like where to pay attention at certain points, that you're going to need a larger hook at certain points, and also a link to community support where she's available on multiple social media platforms, through the Facebook community. And there's an entire Facebook community dedicated to helping crocheters with the 6-day crochet project. There's free resources and there's people to answer your questions. Then there's also a paid membership community, I assume it's paid, the Betty Mcknit verse, for bonus content and exclusive 6-day blanket variations not published elsewhere, and asking questions directly during the community Zoom calls. So it does seem like there's plenty of opportunities for people to be able to ask questions, which is not the case with most knitters and crocheters, I have to say. Most patterns I've worked with, there hasn't been a way of me contacting the pattern designer. So there's a lot of explanation, and I will say that she does make it clear that this is not a beginner pattern. It's an easy pattern, but it's not a beginner pattern. So it's not suitable if you don't know already a certain amount about crochet. And I think that's really important to be upfront about. The pattern itself, I don't find confusing at all. Now, would I find it confusing if I began to work on it? Would it be confusing to me, like as in it wouldn't be clear to me what I was supposed to do? Perhaps. But to me, it looks like a very shorthand pattern. So set it around 2, chain 3, double crochet in same stitch, 2 double crochets in each stitch around, join with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3, and then you should have 28 double crochets. So it just looks to me like a really standard pattern. And then there are interludes where she's saying, if you experience curling during these setup rounds, change to a larger hook. Remember to lay your work down after every round and admire it. While you're admiring, check for curling. Like, I think it's actually charmingly written. And I appreciate the brevity of this. I find it really difficult when patterns are written longhand. So when, for example, it will say something like half double crochet in the first stitch and in every stitch across. When you come to the end of the round, chain one, turn the work, half double crochet in 3 stitches, then pause, then half double crochet in the next 3 stitches. I'm giving a bad example, but I find it really frustrating when things are written in prose, like step by step, because it gives me the illusion that it's more complicated than it is. If somebody just says like row 3 HDC, I just totally understand that means I just need to put a half double crochet in every single stitch around. So I personally find that easier. I can see why some people would find this intimidating, given the abbreviations, and perhaps there are points at which you would feel confused that there isn't enough explanation given. I had a look at the video tutorial, and I feel as though if you were at all confused by the written pattern, the video tutorial is an excellent way of making the pattern more accessible, because it's over an hour long and she's taking you through every step of making the blanket. I personally don't find this pattern to be inaccessible, nor do I find the video to be inaccessible, but I can see why a pattern like this, if you hadn't come across a pattern like this before that used a lot of abbreviations, would be frustrating. And I can also see how the amount of adverts on the blog could be frustrating, because they do interrupt the pattern a lot. And I know a lot of people would choose to pay the $5 or $6 for the PDF so that they didn't have to look at these adverts. And that is your prerogative. I don't believe the adverts make it inaccessible. I will also say that since the conversation that apparently occurred between Knotty Brie Crochet and Betty Mcknit, Betty Mcknit has now put a toggle on the website to make the blog post more accessible. So yeah, there's a button at the top of the page, and you can select an accessibility profile. So motor impaired, blind, dyslexia, colorblind, low vision, cognitive and learning, seizure and epileptic, ADHD. So there is a widget, but I don't believe that was available before. I think that's something new that she's added in. Mrs. Moon and Heaven, Jada, has made a really useful post, a lot of which I agree with. And Betty Mcknit has commented on it, saying that she got the message. She thanked Knotty Brie Crochet for pointing out the accessibility issues, and she has said she's going to address them, and she has now addressed them. So it feels as though it could have ended there, really. And I'm not really sure where the other rumours are coming from, because I have not been able to find one single screenshot of Betty Mcknit doing anything bad at all. Like, I haven't found a screenshot of her being rude to anyone, haven't found a screenshot of her threatening to sue anyone, I haven't found a screenshot of her saying that she's not going to amend the pattern. Nothing. But I can see why some people would find this pattern overwhelming. Now, I think that in the knitting and crochet community, we could be more inclusive. I would say more with knitting than with crochet, but I think that things could be made more inclusive and accessible. And I think patterns like this, when they're only written, can be really intimidating and hard to pass, as in hard to make sense of, and can be overwhelming. And also, like, communities on like Facebook or Reddit or wherever, like forums, like, aren't always very welcoming either. Like, I mean, it's not anyone's fault, but beginners that have questions and don't have real life people they can ask will often be met with like a little bit of hostility or like shortness, just because those same questions get asked over and over again. And I can see why, for somebody with an intellectual disability, or like, for example, like dyslexia or any cognitive difference that makes it difficult to understand and pass large sections of text, it can also be really hard to know what to search for, to know how to formulate the right questions to ask Google. And I think that that's been made worse by that Google AI feature now, which gives you an AI summary at the top, which is almost always wrong. So it can be really difficult to search for the answers that you're looking for and to find things. And I think that's why video tutorials are a great way of making this craft more accessible to people, because you have a visual aid, and you can, a good tutorial will have a close-up of the work and be showing you step by step what you need to do. For example, I know that Passionate Kelsey has some amazing tutorials, like so clear and so like step by step. And when I first was learning to crochet, I watched those a lot and I found them really helpful. Made in the Moment also has some great tutorials, and they will go over in a close-up where exactly you're supposed to put each stitch, and you can kind of follow it visually. And I found Betty Mcknit's visuals very easy. I'm curious, I haven't been able to find answers. I'm curious as to why people also found the video inaccessible and why they needed to have a rewritten pattern in a different form. The knit and crochet community could do more to be inclusive for sure. And I wonder whether a solution to that is to start thinking about having testers living with different disabilities be part of your testing group, and to think about like, okay, how am I making this pattern accessible? But I also think on the flip side of this, it is absolutely impossible for anybody to write a pattern that is accessible to everybody. For example, a pattern not being available in English because the writer is Norwegian and hasn't paid for a translation service for whatever reason doesn't mean that they are biased against me as somebody who only speaks English. It just means the pattern isn't available to me. And somebody who, because of like funding restrictions, isn't able to provide an audio only version of the pattern for those with sight issues isn't necessarily being ableist. I think it's important to bear in mind those concerns and to think like, how do I make this pattern as accessible as I can to as many people as possible? And I think there are certain things that you can do to make accessibility a priority. For example, like making sure that your pattern's available in more than one format. So not just having a written pattern, but also having, for example, a video tutorial. I think that makes it accessible to a lot more people. But in terms of like translating things, having a text to audio function, or having subtitles, or being able to write in like a dyslexia friendly font, or an ADHD friendly way of explaining things, I think that gets into much murkier territory around accessibility, where if you're making something accessible to somebody who's living with combined type ADHD like me, you might be making it like less accessible to somebody who needs things explained in a different way because English is their second language. And I just think it's kind of impossible to expect any one pattern designer to cater to the exact way that you prefer patterns to be written. And I also think that accessibility is something that can never be done perfectly. And I also wonder to what extent this whole drama is related to the way that overconsumption is bleeding into crafting, and the way that the internet is rotting our brains, mine included, and encouraging us to not be satisfied with slow results and with trial and error, and with having to figure things out for ourselves because we need immediate gratification. And virality is so dangerous, I think. Like, I kind of hope I never go viral because it feels so dangerous. It feels like the beginning of the end. And this pattern going viral is why people are critiquing it. It's not uniquely confusingly or badly written. It's being torn down because too many people are trying to make it. And I do wonder, I never want this to sound gatekeepy, but I do wonder whether some people are struggling with it because they simply don't like patterns that are written this way. In which case, that is unfortunate, but there is a video tutorial. And also, not every pattern is going to be written exactly the way that you like it. I've bought patterns and then been like, oh, I hate the way this pattern is written. And it's been really frustrating. I don't like long patterns. I like the pattern to be as short as possible. And when the pattern has like huge paragraphs of text in it that I have to kind of translate, or it has photographs, I find that really confusing. I don't particularly love photograph or video tutorials, and I prefer things to be written down, and I prefer them to be as brief as possible. I like people to use just like the standard abbreviations like K2 TOG for knit two together, things like that. And I like them to be brief, and I like to just know what I'm doing for each row or each round. And sometimes I have to kind of like just basically rewrite the pattern in my notes app. And I'm sure many knitters and crocheters do that. And sometimes I'll watch a video tutorial and be really confused. I've been trying to improve my tension for ages. And I have read and watched so many things about like how continental knitters can improve their tension when they're purling. And when I tell you that I have read so many things about like the leading leg and the other leg of the stitch, like where the leading leg of the stitch is, and like stitch mounting and the angle of the needles and all this stuff. And like, it just really it confused me. It really confused me. And I've even watched videos of how to improve my tension. And for whatever reason, the way the person's explaining it, the way they're holding their needles, I don't get it. And then I found a couple of things, a couple of tips and a couple of explanations and ways of explaining things that have really clicked. And as someone who has taught for years and years, I've taught full time for most of my adult life. I teach mostly young adults. I have learned that teaching is to some extent about clicking. It's a bit like finding a good therapist. Like when I am looking for a therapist, sometimes I go and see somebody and I'm like, you seem like you know your stuff, but like, I just don't really want to talk to you. It doesn't mean they're a bad therapist. They're just not the therapist for me. And so it's the same with teaching. Sometimes a student really doesn't click with my style of teaching. They find it disorganized or chaotic. Other times people find it incredibly refreshing and love what I have to say. It doesn't make me a bad teacher. It means that I'm just not the right teacher for everybody. And it's really important to find the right designers for you, the right teachers for you, and the ways that you can make your craft accessible, because we are responsible for making things accessible to as many people as possible, but we're also personally responsible for some of our own, for like kind of advocating for some of our own needs. And whilst I think it is really important to bear in mind that like some people really do need video, like visual or video examples, they can't just have like written instructions, and some people do need a longer form version of a pattern. It's impossible for every pattern designer to cater to everybody's preferred style of learning or preferred style of communicating. That's just not going to work. And I would say it's just a matter of taste to some extent, a bit like choosing a therapist, a bit like choosing a teacher, a bit like choosing what book you want to read. You can not vibe with something, and that doesn't mean that it's bad. And maybe if you're really struggling with the 6-day star blanket, you just need to make a different blanket, a different star blanket even, and just find a different pattern writer who writes in a way that is clear to you. And that doesn't make Betty Mcknit ableist. It doesn't mean that she's taking anything away from the disabled community. And I would say, actually, I'm pretty impressed at how quickly she has added an accessibility menu to her website to make it more accessible. And I definitely, if I have a website with patterns on it, will look into getting the same thing, because it looks, I'm sure it's not perfect. And I welcome below you letting me know what you think of it. But I think it's pretty good. I would also say that I do wonder, I tried to look at what people were having issues with, particularly with the pattern. And a repeated complaint was about the stitch count. And I can't speak to that because I haven't made the pattern. But all of the other queries and confusion I could find were to do with the abbreviations and some confusion about the instructions. So there were lots of posts on various communities that I could find saying, I'm really confused about Betty Mcknit's pattern. I'm really confused about what she's asking me to do here. And people in that community would reply and say, oh, what she's asking you to do is chain 2, then turn, then do X amount of stitches in this and X amount of stitches in this. And it was confusion about like, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do here. I'm sure any of us who've worked with patterns for any length of time will have had moments like that. With every pattern, I have a moment where I'm like, I'm really not sure what I'm supposed to do here. And I find a way of figuring it out. I either ask someone who knits and crochets, or I Google it and try and find an answer if it's a popular pattern, or I ask someone else who's made it on Ravelry. That's a great way of going about it. Or I just figure it out, or I just trial and error it. And that's another thing I kind of want to cover, is like, I think that it can be really easy to want to blame other people for us not being able to do things. I think sometimes I can go both ways. I can either want to blame other people too much for me not being, I'm like, this pattern must be terrible. Or I'm like, because I'm an elder millennial, I'm like, it must be me. I'm just not good enough. I'm not good enough at anything. I'm just a terrible, like, it's probably just me. And I'm actually doing a pattern test at the moment where I like had to second guess my own counting, because it usually is my counting that's a problem. And in fact, in this case, it was the pattern. There was a mistake in the pattern because it's a test crochet. So that makes sense. And I, after having redone the row twice, asked the group chat and was like, oh no, this is actually just like, there's a wrong number in the pattern, and I corrected it. And I think it's just always like, it could be the pattern, but like, it also could be us. And I think that sometimes we can be overambitious when we start knitting or crocheting. I certainly know I was that way. And I just wanted to make really big projects really quickly, but I really didn't want to put in the time. And I had to learn the hard way. And sometimes, you know, people will just be like, oh, we'll just start with granny squares and just like start with something really small and manageable. I didn't want to do that because I've got ADHD. So I just started with really big projects and effed them up and made loads of mistakes and had to frog them over and over again. And in some cases had to get rid of them altogether. And it all turned me into a better knitter and crocheter. And there's no right or wrong way to become better. But I think we forget about that 10,000 hours rule, that you have to put in 10,000 hours to be really good at something. And that is the opposite of what big internet want us to do. The whole thing about like micro trends and virality bleeding into a really slow craft like knitting and crochet is so dangerous, because we see a 6-day star blanket and we're like, okay, great, I want to make it. And like, we might not have the skills to be able to make it. And that might not be Betty Mcknit's fault. I'm just saying. And I wonder whether it being called the 6-day star blanket, which is an indication that you could make it in 6 days, is part of its appeal and virality, particularly on a kind of brain rot app that I spend a lot of time on, like TikTok, where like everyone's trying to grab your attention. Like every video is really short. Like you have to grab someone's attention in 10 seconds. Everybody's watching the video on 2 times speed. Like the idea that you could make an entire finished object like a blanket in 6 days is very appealing. But then it's frustrating, because obviously like any moment that you feel confused or you're having trouble, that slows the process down. You might not be able to make it in 6 days, and it could be frustrating for you. And I just think that virality and micro trends and instant gratification are kind of the opposite of a slow craft like knitting and crochet, and they don't really work. And I wonder whether that's part of what's happening here, is that like people also feel very impatient, because the whole thing about something going viral and becoming and trending is that like that's why TikTok shop exists, right? It's like, I need it now, like I need it now, but I want to make it, but I don't necessarily have the skills to make it, or it's not necessarily written in a way that is suitable to how I like patterns to be written. But I can't make any other of the 100 star blankets there are out there. I have to make this one pattern because that's the one that's going viral. And I think that might be part of what's happening here. Now, I'm also going to get really, really spicy right now. So if this is it, if this is the moment I get cancelled, then it's been a good run. It's been a good 11 videos. Betty Mcknit is not your mum. She ain't your mum. She's not your mum. She doesn't owe you anything. And I think that ageism and misogyny are playing a big role here. I'm going to say it. Betty Mcknit is older. She's older than me, I believe. I think she's probably a Gen X. And she's probably the age of some of the Gen Z crocheters who are complaining on TikTok. I think she's probably the age of a lot of their mums. But she is not their mum. Teaching and crafting are 2 careers that historically have been ascribed to women and therefore devalued. So any form of caring profession, including teaching, and any form of crafting, has often been devalued. Like crafting is not considered an art the way that, say, painting is. And teaching is not considered a skill the way that medicine or engineering is, when in fact teaching's very difficult. So Betty Mcknit being a teacher and a pattern designer, and being a woman of an age where she may well be old enough to be some of the younger people on TikTok who are complaining's mother, I think it all plays a really big role. And I'm not saying it's explicitly what's happening. I'm saying subconsciously it might be what's happening. Because as someone who's in a teaching profession for a long time, I've seen this happen a lot. We project things onto people. And somebody who is a teacher, a community leader, a woman, particularly a woman of an age where they could be a mother, and a person in a caring profession of any kind, it's often seen as really disgusting to people if they stand up for themselves, if they set strong boundaries, if they say no, if they ask to be paid fairly, if they ask for recognition and compensation for their work. It's not seen as like a boss babe move the way it would be if a younger woman did it. And it's not seen as assertiveness and professionalism the way it would be if a man was doing it. It is seen as being a bitch or greedy or like toxic, when in fact it's just somebody trying to do their job, trying to get through the day, trying to protect their profession, and trying to protect the profession of knitwear and crochet design at large. Because if Betty Mcknit were to say, yeah, go ahead, just rewrite my pattern, paraphrase it, and distribute it to people, take business away from me, and you're not doing anything wrong. That means that any time in the future somebody comes across a pattern written by like an indie designer, could be anybody, and decides, I don't like the way this is written, I'm just going to rewrite it and make it my own and start selling it by myself or giving it away. And it kind of means that it brings up like copyright and plagiarism issues for the community at large. And so it's kind of, Betty, as somebody who's well known in the crochet design community, like she has her own business to protect, her own livelihood to protect, and her own reputation to protect. Because what if Naughty Brie Crochet's pattern doesn't work? What if there are loads of mistakes in it? Are people going to ascribe those mistakes to Naughty Brie Crochet, or are they going to ascribe those mistakes to Betty? She has no say over that. So it's no longer her design. And there's nothing wrong with Naughty Brie Crochet deciding to write a pattern for a different star blanket and just calling it something that isn't the Betty Mcknit 6-day star blanket. You can just call it like crochet star blanket. And you can market it like explicitly as being like written for people with intellectual disabilities who find older or shorthand patterns more difficult. She has her own business to uphold, but she's also protecting the industry at large. I think she's protecting other pattern designers. She would be doing a massive disservice to other pattern designers if she said, okay, fine, yeah, just nick my design. I'm not going to do anything about it. I would also say she's been very classy about the whole thing. Mrs. Moon in Heaven, Jada, has a great video on it. And in that, she says something that I really agree with, which is that a lot of people, when this kind of drama happens, they say, oh, why couldn't you just deal with this offline? Why couldn't you just deal with it privately? She has. There's been Betty Mcknit hasn't posted anything. She hasn't posted anything. The only thing she said is under Jada's video. She just said, like, yeah, I asked her to take it down because it's my pattern. Like, I don't know in what universe that would be okay. Clearly, it's not okay to just take somebody's pattern and start distributing it. But I also took her feedback on board and I told her I would make it more accessible. And I have already started doing that and changed the website. So, like, I don't really know what's going on here. And the final thing I want to talk about is the parasocial. So parasociality is something that TikTok and social media in general is a breeding ground for, YouTube as well. So parasociality is when there is a kind of fake or false interpersonal relationship between a content creator, a person in the public eye, and their audience. And it can create some really difficult and murky dynamics. So somebody can be kind of really lifted up and kind of put on a pedestal because they are they have a lot of followers and they have a big platform and their voice has a wide reach. But they can also be torn down viciously because we are in our Hunger Games era. It is tough out there. And Betty Mcknit has had this blanket go viral and everybody wants to make it, but they're also they kind of want to tear her down as well. I think there's a bit of like covert jealousy going on. And there is also an unreasonable expectation where, like, I think part of parasociality is that we ascribe superhuman values to the people we put on pedestals. And anybody who's had a crush on a celebrity will know what I'm talking about. We've all got our problematic faves. We've all got those people that we like admired as teenagers and they do something shitty and it breaks our hearts and we're furious with them because they're human beings. So they're going to mess up. Nobody writes perfect crochet patterns. And also, it's not that it's just a blanket. It really is just a blanket. And I would also say that it's not any less accessible than any other pattern, any other comparable pattern. It just has come under the spotlight because of this parasociality and because it's gone viral, because it's a good pattern. It's a good pattern. It's not bad at all. Otherwise, it wouldn't have got so popular. It's popular because it's a good pattern. But parasociality means that we hold people to standards and we kind of that are so unreasonable that we almost dehumanize them. So there is a dehumanizing aspect to this as well, where everybody's talking about the crochet community, but nobody's thinking of Betty Mcknit as part of that community who deserves to be treated fairly and well, who also has like feelings and thoughts and is just one person who's designing crochet. She's not like Jeff Bezos. She's Betty Mcknit. She's not Jeff Bezos. And so I think parasociality is also playing a big role. And I think parasociality combined with like ageism and internalized misogyny and a lot of other things, including just like wanting to jump on viral trends and like not wanting to take part in a slow craft in a viral and like instant gratification way. It just doesn't work. I do think that accessibility is incredibly important. It's really important to me. And I think that pushing for accessibility and also flagging up the ways in which the pattern wasn't accessible to people is really important. I think that that's a good thing. But you have to give people time and you also have to respect the fact that they're just a random person. And I think we also have to take personal responsibility to some extent and ask ourselves, like, is this an accessibility issue or is it an issue of me wanting to make an entire ass blanket in one day so I can show my TikTok followers that I made it? and because I need it now, because it's been sold to me so heavily, and because there's this like impatience and panic and immediacy in social media. That's all. I would love to hear your thoughts below, and I might make another video like this, or this might be the last video you ever see from me because I'm a little bit scared. Just in case, you should subscribe to my channel. You should subscribe to my channel. I have a video coming out in a couple of days. It's me making a crochet cardigan. It'll be very chill, very cozy. Nothing like this at all. And I will hopefully see you next time.